Hello and welcome to today's panel discussion hosted by the Atlantic Council and Voice of America. My name is Peter Dickinson. I'll be moderating today's discussion. The topic of today's discussion is the media and the information space of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how the Ukrainian media is coping with the Russian invasion. We will later this week be marking the first anniversary of the Russian invasion throughout the past year of the very traumatic and historic events taking place in Ukraine on the front line. There's also been an extremely dynamic situation in the information space, both in Ukraine and internationally. We've assembled a stellar panel today of people to commentate on this topic and to try and provide you with some insights into where we stand today as the war moves into its second year. So I'd like to begin by just introducing our panelists. We have Sergil Musayeva, the chief editor of Ukrainska Pravda. Michael Boshikyu, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Olga Rudenko, the chief editor of the Ukraine Independent. And Ruslan Petrichka, who is the chief of the Ukrainian service at Voice of America. So before we get into the commentaries from our panel members, I'd like to begin with a brief video presentation from Voice of America.
We're a couple hundred miles outside of Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, and we're driving through an area that was clearly an active battle zone very shortly before we got here, and we understand that Russian forces are right behind us, not specifically chasing us, but heading towards Kyiv. It's Friday evening, and the streets are almost empty here in central Kyiv, but we can hear bombs in the distance. This is the second day of what has become known as the invasion of Ukraine.
Це Шегині, 30 кілометрів до пункту перетину кордону. Тут автівку зупиняють і далі у вас два варіанти. Або рухаєтесь в черзі, або кидаєте машину і йдете пішки.
Ukraine's western city of Lviv has become a major hub for Ukrainians fleeing Russia's mortars and missiles. Anna recorded these brief videos.
They just on these stairs and they are begging, please, we wanted to leave Kyiv because we don't know what to do.
It took them 2 days to reach the Polish border.
What is impacted is everyday life for almost everyone in this country at this time, where there is fear in every corner that there may be fresh attacks, fresh violence, and the scale of the destruction could be so great. Some people say it could be the greatest conflict since World War II.
Зараз ми ірпенських, які приїхали сюди сьогодні. Давайте другу коляску.
A surreal soundtrack greets the sea of humanity fleeing Ukraine, a pianist with a message of peace. A momentary distraction from the misery unleashed by Russia's invasion.
It is remarkable how efficiently Poland has managed to absorb the huge number of refugees arriving over its borders so far. The question is how long that can continue as tens of thousands of refugees continue to arrive every day.
This is Bucha in Ukraine. You may have heard over the weekend Ukrainian forces took this town and all the towns surrounding Kyiv. But as you can see, the violence here was considerable, and authorities say hundreds of civilians were found dead. Many of the bodies were found on the street.
Мы спали, потом папа, мама умерла. А что мне оставалось делать? Да, сын умерла. Я говорю, она с нами. Она все видит и нас охраняет.
Може мені просто не водить.
Since Putin launched his all-out invasion of Ukraine in February, the Russians' Black Sea-based fleet was at the center of the action. Ukrainian Navy forces prevailed.
Думали, что нам смогут где-то там дозвониться. И они спустились и пошли по морю, и папа шел сзади мамы. Тут взрыв.
до глубины души, до слез трогает, когда приходит пожилой человек, какая-нибудь пожилая женщина, и явно она не небольшого достатка, она не богатая, она приносит пакет с морковкой, яблоками и говорит: я купила, но я знаю, что вам это нужно.
Это обстрелы, приезжать на обстрелы, понимать, что именно произошло на этих обстрелах.
More than 400 bodies with sign of torture were found in this mass graveyard in Izum, Kharkiv region. As Russian troops retreated last week in the face of Ukrainian counteroffensive, they left behind chilling signs of horror Ukrainians suffered.
Слава Україні! Героям слава! Міна!
It is difficult to find a home still standing. This area of the city was the hardest hit by Russian shelling since the invasion began on February 24th.
It is just a matter of time when they will strike against your other allies. If we do not stop them now, we must do it.
Russian attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure began in October with massive strikes across the country, killing civilians and knocking out power structures. Since then, the devastation has continued. And as night falls in the capital, some entire neighborhoods are in the dark. But residents say life goes on as normally as possible, with or without the light.
Well, it was powerful footage and a lot of very, very disturbing memories, I would say, there for I'm sure for many viewers and for all of us of the past year. If we can begin the discussion, if I could go first of all to Sevgil. Sevgil is the chief editor of the Ukrainsky Pravda site, which is one of the most, I would say, most respected, most venerable titles in Ukraine. Sevgil, are you with us?
Hello, nice to meet you. Good evening or good morning for you in DC.
Yeah, it's I'm here in Kiev, so it's afternoon for me as well.
I know that in Kiev.
Any of our audience here, it's morning. So, Sevgil, as the chief editor of Ukrainsky Pravda, so you are a veteran of the Ukrainian media sector. You've been at the forefront of Ukraine's development as a young democracy for many years. How has your work changed over the past year? What have been the biggest, most specific changes, and how difficult is it for you to work, to continue to do your job in the current wartime environment?
Thank you for this question. You're absolutely right that Ukrainska Pravda, that was launched in 2000, was a main media in all crucial events in previous history. I mean, during Orange Revolution, we were this #1 source of information for people. During the Revolution of Dignity, for the last 9 years of war, the same. And of course, but we can compare what we faced before with what we faced actually this year, terrible year of full-scale invasion, because challenges for all Ukrainian nation are so huge, and for Ukrainian journalists as well. And the simplest one, just to stay alive when you cover this war, and want to mention this war is very dreadful for Ukrainian journalists and for foreign journalists as well. 32 journalists were killed during this conflict, and among those people, also my friends and good was foreign journalists and Ukrainian journalists. For example, Brent Renault was killed in Irpin, Max Levin, the brilliant photographer, who was also killed. Also financial pressure, because business models were ruined by this war, were destroyed, and you have to face with that. During winter months, of course, we all, like Ukrainian nations, challenged by outages and blackouts, and it also was a challenge just to find everything. But the main one, of course, this is moral pressure, and people in our editorial, among editorial staff and in our newsroom, of course, exhausted, because it's not that we cover something, we cover our own country, we cover our own conflict, we cover our own grief, and it's affected because our colleagues, they lost a parent, they lost parents. For example, one of my colleagues, his father was killed in Bucha. Another my colleague, she lost her father because her father was killed as a soldier. One of our colleagues decided to join the army, and he's a brilliant videographer, but that time he's a soldier and he wants to protect his country, and it's all about choices. And this war is also about choices for Ukrainian journalists, because you're faced with this every single day, just how to cover, for example, and you have to think about, for example, not to publish or not to publish the story of your friend that is in, he was captured, and you have to cover this story, but at the same time, his parents are very panicked about that maybe after this story will be published, he will be tortured more or not, or to publish or not to publish the list of Russian soldiers we received in the first days of war, and those soldiers just a few kilometers from your parents. So the challenges so big, but at the same time, I want to tell you that we have to keep going, and we continue our work, we continue our we are exhausted, but at the same time, we have a lot of resilience, Ukrainian resistance, and we will continue to do our work, because from our work, a lot of things depends. And here I want to mention that we cover not only war crimes, we cover not only frontline, we cover not only living life in different cities in Ukraine. We also cover misconducts of Ukrainian officials, bad governance, or corruption scandals, which is, I think, very important in time of war. And we continue to do that. We continue, even in such difficult circumstances, when your country fights for the right to exist, you have to cover, as an independent journalist, bad things and bad governance, for example, because it's about European values, it's about democratic values, and we have to follow them. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you very much for the work you're doing. You mentioned this last point here, you speak about the challenges of covering difficult subjects for Ukraine, corruption issues, governance issues. Have you had any negative backlash to that? I mean, this is obviously something Ukrainsky Pravda has done for many years, but the situation now is different. Have you had any negative response there, or either from the authorities or perhaps just from the public saying, you shouldn't do this in a time of war?
First of all, I want to clarify that we follow democratic path of Ukraine, and that's why for us it's important. And anti-corruption sphere is important for Ukrainska Pravda for the last maybe 90 years. We focused on that, and we were famous of our investigations for years and years, and this year of war is not an exception. And we want to be sure that our efforts will help this country to clean all these bad things and misconducts, and to help move forward even in such difficult times, because we have two front lines, one front line with Russia and another one with misconducts, with corruption. And we will protect this front line as well. Your question about, of course, we received some negative comments, and our journalists were bullied by votes by political party. Of course, we feel like a pressure when we publish a story. And our main investigative reporter, Mikhailo Tkach, who is a head of investigative team in Ukrainska Pravda, of course, he also received some threats in his phone, in his social media, and we reported about them. We reported to Committee to Protect Journalists about those threats. Of course, this is kind of negative a negative sphere of our work, but it will not stop us. It will never stop us, even like when we receive threats, when we receive like some negative comments, or we are bullied by someone in social media, it will not. But of course, I think that for international community, for international organizations, it's important to protect and to support independent journalism in Ukraine in different ways.
I see. Well, thank you for your comments. So if I can now bring in Michael. Michael, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Michael. So you have been covering Ukraine for many years. You've been observing the situation in Ukraine and commentating, and are a regular feature in the international coverage of Ukraine. But if we can look at the Ukrainian media environment for a moment, what do you see as the key challenges and risks, perhaps, of this first year that you're noticing, both in terms of restrictions on the media, perhaps in terms of a military or governmental restrictions, and also simple practical restrictions, financial restrictions, for example?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. And I can't say enough words to salute the work of Ukrainian journalists, people at Ukrainska Pravda, for example, Kyiv Independent, VOA. A lot of people talk about the bravery, the irrepressible resilience of the Ukrainian people. If there's one group who really represent those two things, it's our Ukrainian journalists. So I really take my hat off to you. You know, this was a very, very interesting time for Ukrainian journalists from my perspective. From what I observed, I came to Ukraine before the start of the war. And at that time, a lot of Western media organizations were still setting up, not really sure whether the full-scale invasion will happen. Well, it did, of course. And they really, I think, rushed to hire fixers and producers and that sort of thing. So in a way, it was also a watershed event for Ukrainian journalists, because a lot of them were hired by the Western news organizations to assist in their coverage. I'll give you an example. I mean, I spent a lot of time at the CNN pop-up bureau in Lviv, and you know, we had a rotating team of anchors and producers and journalists. And every day, pretty much, I would watch the work of Ukrainian journalists who were hired by CNN. And without their help, without their story ideas, without their interpretation, that sort of thing, they couldn't have done, I think, half of the work that they did. So that was a really interesting time. And I think what also I found heartening was that these news organizations, and as well as the Ukrainian ones, were in a position this time compared to 2014 to provide PPE, personal protection equipment, to a lot of their staff. I remember early on around Easter time, we took a media trip to Chernihiv, and I noticed that a lot of my Ukrainian journalist friends were fully kitted out, you know, with protected equipment. In the old days, it was the foreign journalists who had all of the, you know, vests and helmets and stuff like that. But this time we saw Ukrainian journalists. And I appreciate really, again, I take my hat up to Ukrainian journalists, what Sevgi was talking about on how difficult this was to cover. I can't speak to that. But the other thing I'd say, and it's a bit of a controversial topic, but I talk about it because it came up in panels earlier on in the war, is the damage some of the government actions have done to Ukrainian media infrastructure. What I mean by that is the 24/7 telemarathon. A lot of media owners, even from the biggest stations, have told me that even before the war started, because of the weak advertising market, they were in a very perilous position. But after this telemarathon was instituted, and let's admit, a lot of stations were under pressure to join it, they basically went on to life support, no income whatsoever. And also there was, I guess, a feeling of obligation to be very patriotic. But I think now, several months, almost 1 year into the war, I think some stations have now exited from that. But, you know, whether they're going to be able to survive financially is a really, really big question. So, you know, a few months ago, there was that, and I'll wrap up shortly, Peter, there was that reconstruction rehabilitation conference in Europe, and there was zero talk about the Ukrainian media and about how to support them and how to help them recover from this war. So I think in future discussions on aid to Ukraine, how to rebuild Ukraine, it's going to be really, really important to consider what the Ukrainian media institutions need. One more quick thing on the last point on this one is I'm also concerned about overreach by the Zelensky administration. We saw this, for example, in the recent crackdown on corruption, which, by the way, a lot of it was unveiled by Ukrainian journalists. But for example, there was overreach there, banning elected politicians from traveling overseas because some Ukrainian MP was found sunning himself on a Thai beach. Similarly, I think when it comes to censorship or responding to critical coverage, the administration has to be very, very careful because there, as Seviko said, there is two fronts in this war. One is the fighting Russian aggression, but the other one, of course, is continuing that fight on corruption. And Ukrainian journalists play a key role in unveiling a lot of those corrupt schemes.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. There's some very, very, very pertinent points. Especially the financial aspect. I think Ukraine's media, in general, most of it was never profitable, and it was often a case of how little can how much you can reduce your losses. And now, of course, the market doesn't exist anymore. Essentially, the market's totally crashed. So.
And just quickly, Peter, I forgot to mention, Kyiv Independent has done an amazing job leveraging technology to fundraise. I think it's historic, helping other Ukrainian media institutions, giving grants to them. So hats off to you guys as well. You really showed how to leverage technology and, survive during this war using fundraising tools. So well done.
Well, that actually leads very nicely into our next speaker. So thank you for that. Very, very smooth link. Yeah, so Olga Rudenko, the chief editor of the Kyiv Independent. Olga, are you with us?
Yes. Just before you jump into the question, just a little clarification. We don't give grants to other media ourselves, but we do participate in. We use our platform to amplify existing fundraising campaigns, especially in the early days of the invasion. That was helpful.
I see. Okay, thank you for the clarification. So the Kyiv Independent is, I would say, without question, the success story of the Ukrainian media landscape of the past year. It's been quite a remarkable tale that sort of dovetails with Ukraine's broader resilience and innovation that we've seen over the past year. It's gone from a startup in November 2021, essentially, to the main English language voice, the main international voice of Ukraine by the beginning of the war a few months later. So it was an incredible journey. You've since gone on to set records in terms of your fundraising work. You have a huge following on social media. You've received various personal and collective recognition from the international community. So it's been a very exciting story to follow and a very inspirational story. But perhaps you could just give us a bit of the insight from your perspective. How challenging has that journey been for you, and how sustainable is your current is the business model, is the way that the Kyiv Independent is currently structured?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question. Well, Sergei gave a wonderful, very exhaustive answer about the challenges of Ukrainian journalists. Just to add to that, some challenges that are specific to our team, because our audience is abroad, is, well, first of all, the war fatigue that we've been talking about all the time. It is sort of happening. It's happening and throwing back. So we are constantly seeing that, the numbers on the website are dropping and rising, and the overall trend is quite frightening, to be honest, because this is something that, I think about every day, how we can keep the attention on Ukraine, and more importantly, how we can find ways to keep talking about the story of the war so the world keeps listening. I'm saying that this challenge is somewhat different from what our Ukrainian colleagues have, because they're talking to the Ukrainian audience, and for the Ukrainian audience, this is the war is still going on. This is what they're living, and so as far as I understand, their churn of attention is not as bad as ours. For us, it's a matter of how do you keep telling this story, which is a horrible story that needs to be heard, but essentially it's the same story for a long time. How do you keep telling it so the world does not tune out and just move on to the next, next horrible things happening somewhere? And because, as you mentioned, we've been quite successful with fundraising, and it allowed us to experiment and to try different things. We are now we're now facing another challenge. How do we leverage this success, these resources that we got, to get the maximum result and to ensure that we're sustainable and to ensure that we find the right ways to tell the story of Ukraine? And it's one thing to reach a big audience in March 2022, when all the eyes are on Ukraine. And if you have just quick news in English from the ground, then you're going to be seen and you're going to be heard and you're going to be followed on Twitter. 1 year later, though, how do you keep making, how do you keep the connection with the audience? How do you make sure that they're still invested? How do you keep talking to them? That takes creativity, that takes some strategic thinking. And now is a time when we need to get a lot smarter about what we do. And this is actually something that we are tackling right now. We, last year was kind of a whirlwind for us, and this year we want to do things more strategically and more in a smarter way. So, as I said, the biggest challenge is how to leverage the attention and resources to to achieve the mission and to do our work the best way possible.
And in terms of developing the coverage you have, in terms of maintaining that level of engagement, are you finding that you need to move more towards more in-depth reports or more human interest stories, or to go away from the sort of military blow by blow, attacks here, defenses there? Mm-hmm. What kind of trends are you seeing?
Well, we've been doing both. We've been doing, this is what's happening on the front line, as well as a lot of human stories. Human stories, surprisingly or not surprisingly, depends on where you're looking from. They are not getting that much attention. I think the time when a story about somebody who survived a torture chamber, a Russian torture chamber, could collect a lot of page views are long gone. But anytime somebody raises that issue in our newsroom, I say that we need to, even if that story gets, 100 page views, we need to keep reporting on that, because that's, the way I see it, it's writing the first draft of history. It's documenting this horrible things, because years from now, there are this accounts of survivors, these testimonies, they have to live somewhere, and I want them to live on our website in English to, as a documentation of the horrible things that Russia did in Ukraine. And as they, hopefully years from now, we'll be able to look back at that and analyze what went so wrong, and how to, as a global community, how to not let it happen again. So I think human stories are extremely important, and we're gonna keep on writing them and keep on producing videos and stuff. And the big focus of the conversation internally is actually about formats, naturally, but that's been the conversation, in journalism for many years. Do you follow every trend? Do you jump on TikTok? Do you do more podcasts? Do you do more videos? And there is, I know from my previous experience, that there is a big danger there of just chasing the trends without a purpose, so to say. Like, everybody's doing TikTok, let's do TikTok. So we're trying to whenever we have these discussions, we try to really challenge each other and question, why do we want to do this? What are we trying to reach? How does this align with the general mission, with the purpose? What is this getting us? And it takes a lot of, I would say, discipline and strategic thinking to do that. And that's, honestly, something not probably not very natural for journalists. We are more of a chaotic people, by nature. We are like following stories, jumping on things that are hot in the moment. And we are now trying to, build up some discipline and some, as I said, strategic thinking to make sure that we're sustainable, and then make sure that, yes, it was great that we were able to be here during this first year of the war and the second year of the war to report on what's happening. But I want to make sure that the Kyiv Independent is still here when Ukraine is being rebuilt, and to also tell the world the story of that, because it's going to be just as important.
I see. And if I could just touch upon the Kyiv Independent as the most prominent English language voice of Ukraine, platform of Ukraine, or gateway to Ukraine, do you have a lot of interaction with your international colleagues, with the international media covering Ukraine? And what's your impression in terms of the coverage this year? Do you think we've seen any marked changes or improvements since compared to the coverage of the war from 2014 to 22, for example?
Yes, I think there's been, an education in process with many global publications, just learning more about Ukraine, understanding more about how it is not necessarily, like a satellite of Russia. Because for years, let's admit, for many, many years, for decades, the West has been looking at Ukraine and the whole region as Russia plus, like Russia and something murky around it. Ukraine was covered by journalists coming from either from Moscow or from Brussels. And there were no bureaus here except for some news agencies. So that way of looking at Ukraine through the Russian lens has been shifting since the start of the full-scale invasion, and that's good to see. A lot of international journalists are doing an amazing work in Ukraine. That said, of course, mistakes happen. We have covered quite extensively the issue of foreign media using, not on purpose, the language of Russian propaganda in their coverage, and that means reporting about referendums in the occupied territories as if they are an actual democratic vote, and that means calling the war a special military operation, following the vocabulary offered by Vladimir Putin. Unfortunately, those are things that we've seen in the best mainstream Western media, and we use our platform and our voice to talk about that and to raise this issue, and I think it's been very important. That said, we've also been I'm well aware that we've also been a source for and a major source for Western journals covering Ukraine. That's what I've been told all the time, that especially our Twitter feed and our Telegram channel and our website news feed have been very useful for Western media. And I've also heard that some of the feedback I've been getting, that we are sometimes seen as sort of, we're not a fact-checking organization, and I want to stress that, but I have heard reports about some Western, like European media outlets, where editors would, when they are in doubt on whether to put up a certain news report coming out of Ukraine, they would check in with our website just to make sure that we've written about that. And that would be for them the badge of like, this is trustworthy. And that was a huge compliment. That was like that level of trust from our colleagues. That was very nice to hear.
That is probably the biggest compliment you can get. Yeah, certainly from fellow media. Thank you, Olya. Thank you. So Ruslan, if we can turn to you now. Now, as the head of the Ukraine service at Voice of America, Ruslan, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Ruslan. So you work with, as I understand, a lot of and have worked with over the years, a lot of Ukrainian television channels. You share content with them and cooperate with them. First of all, how has the war impacted on the work you do, the kind of content you're producing, and the kind of exposure and the kind of partnerships that you've had in the past? How's it affected that? And also, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on how you think the war and things like the television marathon have impacted on the Ukrainian TV situation, the Ukrainian TV market in general?
Hey, thank you, Peter, for having me here, and thank you, Atlantic Council, for organizing this. Before I go into my part of the conversation, I would like to extend my greatest sympathies to and appreciation to Olga and Sevgil for the work they are doing. This is actually, to be a journalist in Ukraine in this time, they are really doing a good job, both of the organization. And I know personally several people here in Washington, D.C., both in the media environment and outside the media environment, they, when in doubt, when they need more information about Ukraine in English, they physically type your organization and go and read what you have to write. So this work is very important. Being here at Voice of America provides me a very interesting perspective on what's happening in Ukraine. I'll just give you a little bit of the historical reference. The Ukrainian service was established at Voice of America in 1949. Since then, Voice of America was speaking in Ukrainian to Ukrainians, trying to first combat Soviet propaganda and then turning to combating Russian propaganda and internal Ukrainian propaganda, trying to establish the best quality journalism and be a model of journalism for Ukraine and for Ukrainian media. And historically, we have had probably the biggest, we were rated as the most trusted international media organization in Ukraine for a long time in different polls, at least for last 15 years when I was here with Voice of America. And before the war started, before this invasion started, maybe in November of 2021, when U.S. Administration started sounding alarms about the imminence of Russian attack, we started to report on that. And I noticed that our messages were not coming through as they were before. Ukrainian public, even Ukrainian media, Ukrainian people in power that we were talking to, they were very critical and dismissive of our reports. And the talking points were like, what do you know about that? So Ukraine, we have been in this situation for 8 years already. The war has happening around us for a long time. Russia is not going to attack, or something like that in that regard. So I noticed that Ukraine put itself in some kind of sleeping mode, willingly or unwillingly. And I don't blame Ukrainian public or Ukrainian journalists about that. But this narrative was Ukraine became kind of its own echo chamber in that. It was very difficult to get through this with our messages. The comments were negative on our social media and in personal conversation, until probably the couple of weeks before the invasion started, when U.S. Embassy started to pull out their personnel from Kyiv, when businesses starting to pulling out. We had a huge spike on our social media, anywhere we would report to, and Ukrainian media organizations started to reaching out to us with requests to do a report from Washington D.C. to tell what's exactly happening. So I saw this trust that I thought was a little bit ruined for some reason started to being rebuilt. This bridge that we had started to get back in operation. And since then, I believe we have one of the largest and most consistent viewership numbers on all platforms that we're reporting to. I would take probably a couple of more moments to get you some information what we are doing and what missions emerged since the beginning of the war. For Ukrainian service at Voice of America. So we are not a large service. We had less than 20 people before the war started, and we produce content from Washington, D.C. to Ukraine, in Ukrainian. We have reporters on the ground, we have reporters in Europe, we have reporters in Washington, D.C. And Our biggest impact currently is through different TV channels that still report in Ukraine, both in marathon and independently. We provide them with our correspondents in Washington D.C., in White House, in State Department, in U.S. Capitol building, so everywhere that we can get access to the speakers, and we offer these topics to Ukrainian TV channels, and they most of the time, whenever we can offer them anything, they can take us and on without any censorship, without any problems, they include our reporter directly to their shows, and we can deliver this message to Ukrainian public through affiliates. But also we started this accidentally, actually started this very interesting format that is being probably one of the most popular for us, is a live, large live, long-term live streams of important events or speeches with simultaneous translation to Ukrainian language. And we saw that this element was missing from Ukrainian public, and people wanted to hear this, whatever Biden has to say, whatever Blinken has to say, or whatever the press conference after the Rammstein conference is. Ukrainian public wants to hear this directly in Ukrainian, and this is missing. Ukraine, for many reasons, Ukrainian media cannot provide this kind of content, and we found this content very, very popular for Ukrainian audience. So currently, we're working on as we speak, on the special broadcast from Poland, where President Biden is ready to deliver his address after visit to Kyiv. And we have already been approached by numerous media organizations that are going to be cross-posting our signals, including one of the TV channels that is currently working for TV Marathon, and they probably will include our signal directly to the TV Marathon in Ukraine. I wanted to get back to one of the comments that Olga Rudenko said about the different formats, whether you should be on TikTok or not. We're also experimenting with different kind of formats, how to reach Ukrainian audience directly. And social media has been the key. It definitely has been the key, because everybody's on their cell phones and watching through social media. You have to be where the audience is. And the same way the bad actors, Russian propagandists, or whatever, call them bad actors, use social media for their advantages. The same way these new tools can be used by responsible media organizations as well, with the same level of success. So whatever piece and bits that we put on social media, especially on Instagram, from very important coverage or interviews that we have, it has usually much more. It gives much more numbers of viewers and engagement than at traditional outlets like a website or a long-form news show on YouTube. The difference is you have to be really, I'm talking about myself and what kind of instructions we provide to our reporters. We have to be really, really strict with our editorial policies, because we have to be very mindful whether we are giving the story full in this short social media formats, whether this is comprehensive, whether this is balanced. Because if we continue to emphasize our standards as the basis of our reporting, and people continue to trust us, then we can wrap important messages in this small kind of social media formats and make them help them reach audience and continue to be trusted source of information for people that prefer this kind of platforms in their daily life.
Thank you, Ruslan. Okay, so if we can now move on to the question and answer section of the panel discussion. First question I'd like to address to Sevgil. Sevgil, we hear a lot about Russian disinformation. This is a topic that's has been discussed for many years now. Again, largely it went mainstream after 2014. But it's often discussed now in terms of the international audiences. Now, there's a sense that Ukrainians have become less vulnerable to Russian disinformation. Sorry, Sebgul, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm with us.
Yeah. Sorry, I just couldn't see you on my screen there. So there's a sense that Ukrainians are somehow less vulnerable now. They've become much more aware of disinformation, and obviously Ukrainian restrictions have prevented Russian information reaching in the kind of volumes that it used to, going back 10 years or so. But how much of a threat is this today to Ukrainians? How big a challenge is Russian disinformation, specifically for Ukrainian audiences?
Thank you for the question. And here I want to jump to the question of the threat for international community and to the threat to different countries about Russian propaganda and Russian disinformation. Even today, I had a conversation with an Indian journalist, and when she asked me, do you know that BBC broke down in your country? I asked, it is still Russia Today in your country? And she said, of course, yes. And I think that this is a big problem. If, for example, in India, BBC is cut by officials and Russia Today is still on. And I want to mention, for example, I visited a conference about Latin American conference of Latin American media, and in a lot of countries, Russia Today still work and still spread disinformation. And I want to mention that in Arabic countries, Russia Today is #1 source for information, and I'm not kidding. Al Jazeera in the third place, and the first one is Russia Today, and so this is not. That's why it's not a question of Ukrainian threat and threat for Ukraine from Russian disinformation and propaganda. We live in this situation already 8 years, 9 years actually. And we are much prepared and we are much ready just to protect ourselves, because we experienced that already for 9 years. But other countries, this is a big question for me personally, and I want to put your attention on such countries like Arabic countries, for example, countries of Latin American, global South, Africa, for example, and even in India, where you just can kind of BBC, but Russia Today still works. So this is a problem, Russia Today was cancelled in European countries after the big invasion. It wasn't cancelled in 2014, in 2015, and I want to clarify that the Russia propaganda is also responsible for what happened in Ukraine, because for the years Russian propaganda dehumanized Ukrainians, and you know that Putin started this war with what goals? Just want to mention his goals: denazification and demilitarization, and a lot of Russian soldiers, they believed that they came to Ukraine to kill Nazis and fascists. And it was like that. And this is totally responsibility of Russian propagandists, and also European countries. They didn't stop Russian propaganda, spread of Russian propaganda even today. Thank you. So don't think about Ukraine, think about the whole world and the disruption of Russian propaganda in different countries, not even in Europeans, in Arabic countries, in Latin America, in India. This is a question.
No, I think you raise a good point there about the focus we tend to have on Western media, and there is a sense that Russian propaganda has less influence now in the international, as in the Western media, the American, European media, but the presence of Russian messaging in the so-called global South, or the developing world, in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, is very strong. I think it's a very important point. But just to come back to Ukraine specifically, with the restrictions on Russian media, are you still seeing some Russian talking points coming into the Ukrainian information space via Telegram, for example? Or...
Yeah, of course. Telegram, this is the main threat for Ukrainian information field. And I think that the anonymous Telegram channels, you can't understand who is behind them. And of course, like a lot of Telegram channels now, they used by Ukrainian authorities, Ukrainian government, for example, also anonymous channel. But the influence of Russian narrative is also very huge in Ukrainian Telegram channels. And even The whole photos, for example, after missile attacks, they first published in Russian Telegram channels and in Ukrainian as well. And I think that the main threat is Telegram, like for me personally. And I think that, and unfortunately for a lot of people in Ukraine, Telegram channels, this is the #1 source of information. This is true, like, and like more than 65% of people, they consume news from anonymous Telegram channels in Ukraine.
Yes, I see. That's my impression as well. It's a very, very influential platform. Okay, the next question, if I'd like to address to Olga Rudenko. We have a question regarding Western support for the Ukrainian media. What support does the Ukrainian media need from the West? And I think the idea, although it doesn't state exactly, we're talking in not simply financial support, but also perhaps institutional support, maybe content sharing. What's been your experience of support from the West, and what would you like to see more of? Olga.
Well, thank you for the question. Actually, two speakers have touched upon this issue earlier in the event. As Sergei mentioned, the financial pressure on Ukrainian media is pretty big right now because the financial models were ruined overnight. And it's not the case for us because we've been successful with fundraising, but we're special in that way because of where our audience is and who our audience is. But at the same time, for many Ukrainian media, the #1 issue is just paying their bills. And there are media that, they have enough money to last for the next 2 months, and then they don't know what's going to happen. So and as Michael mentioned, when we're talking about reconstruction of Ukraine, about rebuilding Ukraine, media has to be part of that conversation. Fixing the damage down to the Ukrainian media landscape should be part of the conversation. And actually, we can use that. Maybe we can use this opportunity to make Ukrainian media better than they were before the war, because those big TV channels that are now forced to be part of the one marathon, they were controlled mostly by Ukrainian oligarchs before the war. They were not independent. Maybe this is the chance of rebuilding them into something different after rebuilding Ukrainian television into something different after the war ends. But that just needs to be part of the conversation. And also, I think another element of support is when our Western allies, Western partners are talking to, I want to be very careful with with how I phrase it, are talking with the government of Ukraine, with the administration about certain conditions on which the aid arrives. When they're talking about reforms, when they're nudging the government to conduct judicial reform and other reforms, I think the freedom of media should be part of the conversation there too, because there is always even for the best possible rulers, there is always a temptation to overreach and to silence the media when the media is reporting something that is uncomfortable. And being an inconvenience, and we need to, and because we are amid a war, we have a martial law in Ukraine. There is a danger that it can be used against journalists, that there can be overreach. So I think this is just something that the international community needs to be watching really closely, and making sure that everybody in Ukraine understands that it's not just winning the war that matters. It's what Ukraine is like when it wins the war that matters. What kind of values it has. Does it still have free media? And that should just be always part of the conversation.
Yes, very much so. The idea of what we're fighting for, what Ukrainians are fighting for. I remember, it reminds me of a quote from Churchill during World War II when his government were very apologetic about budgets for culture expenditure in 1942, I think, during World War II. And they said, well, we're very sorry, Prime Minister Churchill, maybe we should reduce this spending. And Churchill said, well, if we don't spend money on our culture, what are we fighting for? What is the purpose? I think from a Ukrainian point of view, free speech and a vibrant media is absolutely essential for the future of the country. Now, if I could bring Michael in. Michael, I believe you're aware of some efforts to offer more support by the international community. You've mentioned the Portuguese initiative.
Right. Yeah. Just quickly, thank you for the question. I also wanted to add something that leads from Olga's answer as well and others about the challenges faced by Ukrainian journalists during the wartime. And there's one Ukrainian journalist who I'm quoting in an article later today, but saying that we have to choose every word, every video frame, every caption with utmost care so as not to give Russian propaganda's fuel. Their journalist said, by the way, her name's Anna Brovka, our enemy is very insidious and uses all elements of propaganda. So I've been traveling quite a bit through Europe in the past few weeks, and what I'm seeing there is Russian propaganda in overdrive. And that's right, Russia Today, RIA, and other outlets are heavy at work, challenging the Ukrainian narrative in many African, Asian, and other regions of the world. The one thing we're seeing also in this war is the Chinese and the Russians mirroring each other. And the Chinese are masters at this very kind of below the radar insidious propaganda efforts. For example, establishing fellowship institutes in British Columbia, Canada, things like that, quietly funding or bankrolling Hollywood. So movies that come out don't contradict their point of view. So I think this is something that Western governments are only catching up with. They haven't devoted hardly enough resources to counter Russian propaganda. A lot more has to be done. And I don't mean to rally against my own Canadian government, but we see day in and day out the Russian embassy in Ottawa put out lies and false narratives about what's happening in Ukraine. And guess what? Not one Russian diplomat has been expelled by Canada. It's disgraceful, where the Europeans have expelled well over 200. So one of the ideas that's come up to kind of answer two challenges. One is that in this war, a lot of Ukrainian journalists have been displaced. A lot are actually in Europe, and they're not necessarily working in their own profession. And then, of course, the other one, as I mentioned, is the real tidal wave of Russian propaganda. So there's an idea afoot to use Portugal as a base to set up a Ukrainian media hub where trusted and high quality content about Ukraine, but also about what Ukrainians are doing outside of the country can be distributed to various television outlets in Portugal, elsewhere in Europe, in their native languages. It's something that the World Congress of Ukrainians has been involved in, but it's something that, for example, we've spoken to CNN Portugal about. They're excited about this. But we'll keep you posted about this effort. But I think it's going to be part of that whole rebuilding effort of helping to support Ukrainian media, putting Ukrainian journalists, giving them the opportunity rather to show their best talents and qualities, but also really, really solid effort to counter that Russian propaganda. Because one more quick thing, if I can, TikTok came up. I've actually watched a lot of TikTok during this war, and it actually, for me, gave me an insight into a lot of the issues that are being within you. For example, the language debate, Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers debating on TikTok on how they should deal with each other. But also, you wouldn't believe how many videos there are, for example, of Ukrainian asylum seekers in Canada and elsewhere giving advice to other Ukrainians on how to move to Canada, how to put up with high rents and that sort of thing. So it's served as a very, very useful tool in this war to inform people. So I urge all of you to have a look at some of the incredible Ukrainian contributors on TikTok. It's gaining even more traction, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Well, unfortunately, we've now just passed the 1 hour mark, our allocated hour. Frankly, we could have gone on for much longer, but I understand that life goes on. We must move on. So I'll end the panel discussion now. I would like to thank all of our panelists for some really, really insightful commentaries. So Seb Gill, Michael, Olga, and Ruslan, thank you for your invaluable contributions. I think it's been very interesting. I hope our audience has found it interesting. I certainly have. And I would also, if I may, like to thank particularly Seb Gill and Olga for the very, very important work you do in terms of bringing the Ukrainian voices to the international audiences and to Ukrainian audiences also. It's hugely important at a very, very important time in Ukraine's history and in European history. So God bless you and good luck to your efforts. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you'll join us again on the Atlantic Council soon. And thank you also to our partners at the Voice of America. Thank you.
Thank you.